Hello and welcome to the second video on legal and ethical issues in the contemporary media today, where we're going to focus on data harvesting. Now, this is commonly referred to as the currency of contemporary media, where it's actually no longer advertising that media deals with, but rather personal information of users. And we've chosen to look at this particular issue for a very specific reason. The VCE Media Study Design makes explicit reference to data aggregation and harvesting, where they say that changes to the media have contributed to business models that are based on data aggregation and harvesting and the sale of personal information. So once again, we're covering our bases by making sure that we understand how this is done, as well as the legal and ethical implications that arise out of it. But first, we need to know a couple of basic definitions when we're talking about data and personal information. So data harvesting, as the agricultural name suggests, is really similar to the process of gathering crops because this involves the collection and storage of data for future use. So when you're going to a media website, it will collect data from you and store it somewhere so that the media organization can use it later. Now, data aggregation is the process of taking your personal information along with those of other users and grouping them together in order to summarize and form some conclusions from that data. So this is where a media organization like YouTube might take the data of what a whole bunch of different users have watched in the past in order to suggest to you similar videos that you might like to watch in the future. Data protection is the responsibility to keep information private and to ensure that there are safeguards to prevent its misuse. Data protection can apply to the individual as well as institutions who are using audience data. And finally, personal information, or sometimes referred to as personally identifiable information, or PII for short, is any data that can be linked to an individual. These include things such as your name, birthday, address, a driver's license, phone number, email address, etc. It's important to note that when we're talking about data in the media, not all data is PII, but some of it is, and of course, that becomes a more sensitive issue. And so why is it that media institutions are actually collecting audience data? Well, this is how modern media organizations like YouTube, TikTok, or Netflix actually build their business practice. Because harvesting and aggregating data is only part of the process. What they do with that data next is what really counts. Contemporary media institutions will use personal identifiable information and other user data to increase audience engagement by tailoring content to their particular needs, as well as making advertising more relevant by targeting specific ads to specific users, thereby delivering better outcomes for their advertisers. At the end of the day, services that are free to use, such as YouTube or TikTok, are not products for you, the user, but actually you, the user, is the product for their advertisers. So let's look at a case study in terms of how data is being used, and we'll look at YouTube because YouTube is actually owned by the same parent company as Google, a company named Alphabet. And so the data harvested by YouTube is aggregated with other user data from Google Search, Chrome, Maps, and Android devices. This can include information such as your personal information tied to your Google account, so name, phone number, birthday, etc. Any online activity that you perform in Chrome or through Google search engines, so these could be search terms, the websites that you've visited, the apps that you have used through the Google Play Store, and any YouTube videos that you have searched for or watched, etc. Now, Google actually provides a little bit of transparency for users on this, where they can actually see their own online activity and witness what Alphabet is actually collecting from their online activity. Now, users do get the chance to tailor this information and limit the amount of private data that Alphabet is collecting. However, the default option is for all of this private information to be shared, and users actually have to go out of their way and know what they're looking for in order to turn that data harvesting off. YouTube data is also aggregated with the things that you create inside Google Documents, such as calendar events and even some parts of users' Gmail. Finally, if you use Google Maps and other GPS services tied to Google, your location information is collected by Alphabet, and that can be used in YouTube, as we'll see in an example in a moment. So you can see through the vast amounts of data that YouTube, Google, and affiliates are collecting can actually raise a bit of concern amongst audience members. But of course, YouTube will argue that they are applying this data in order to better serve the audience themselves. YouTube will apply this data to promote audience engagement, thereby giving audiences more of what they want and keeping them on their platform for longer. YouTube's recommendations algorithm suggests videos on a user's custom landing page and up next feed by analyzing their previous search terms, watch history, and other user activities such as likes, shares, subscriptions, playlist creation, etc. While users do have the agency to change their data settings to limit or alter this recommended content, the algorithm is a really powerful tool. Studies have demonstrated that the recommended videos account for 70% of all videos watched on YouTube. So that means 7 out of 10 times that you go to YouTube, you're actually not going for a purpose of finding something specific, but just watching what they dish out to you. And here we thought audiences had more agency in contemporary media. Now, one of the criticisms of YouTube's recommendations algorithm is that critics of the platform have raised the concern that by customizing individual users' experiences, YouTube is creating what has been termed filter bubbles, which push audiences into consuming more and more extreme versions of the same content and limiting them from seeing alternative experiences. This is very much a contemporary version of the agenda setting function. A project called TheirTube actually aims to highlight how widely diverse YouTube recommendations can be by allowing users to see what sort of recommended videos are presented on the landing pages of people who are perhaps more conservative and lean to right-wing politics, or are progressive and lean to the left, or even if they've watched a couple of conspiracy theory videos in the past. And so it becomes a little bit concerning that just based on what you have watched in the past limits what you are able to see in the future. And in the previous video, we've actually talked about how this can lead to the polarization of opinions and eventually harassment and hate speech targeted to people with opposing political views. The second reason that YouTube uses data is to target advertising to audiences. By aggregating user data from Google's suite of services, YouTube is able to micro-target their advertising. That is, they will serve ads customized to a user's personally identifiable information, niche demographic, and their individual online activity. When we're talking about this use of data for advertising, it is really important to note that YouTube, like most digital media companies, does not sell user information to advertisers. This is a really common misconception made by many people, including the VCE Media Study Design. Unfortunately, the claims made by the study design are actually incorrect, because instead YouTube via Google AdSense sells access to audience attention in terms of the ad space. They do not on-sell audience data to the advertiser. Because of course, it's this data that makes Google and YouTube such big, profitable companies. To sell that data would be like Colonel Sanders selling the recipe to the 11 secret herbs and spices in his Kentucky Fried Chicken. One case study that we can look at in terms of how YouTube can actually use such specific information to target advertising can be seen in their partnership with a Hyundai ad campaign, where using search history and GPS location information, Google helped Hyundai to pinpoint when potential car buyers actually walked into the doors of a competitor's dealership. These users were then served ads on YouTube promoting Hyundai vehicles. Users who might have been shopping in Hyundai dealerships but then left without buying a car were also served ads, but these ones were slightly different. These instead included special prices to entice them to buy. So what would happen is people would walk into a car dealership with their phone in their pocket and Google Maps switched on, that information being harvested by Google and then aggregated and shared with YouTube, who would then serve those same users ads for Hyundai whenever they next logged on to YouTube. Even if this wasn't on the same phone device that they used when they went to the dealership, they still might see it on a laptop if they were logged into their same Google account. And this had a great result for Hyundai because it guaranteed that car buyers were targeted with specific ads. And this actually resulted in 41,000 car buyers reconsider Hyundai when purchasing. A huge victory as far as ad campaigns go. And so let's think about how this affects the stakeholder relationships. Well, contemporary media institutions like YouTube now wield great power by applying user data to their business practices in order to control audience experience and behavior. And now we haven't placed this little media bubble right up against institutions because audiences do have a little bit of agency here. Some might say that they have the appearance of greater agency, but this is an illusion. Few users actually know what data is being harvested and how they can adjust or limit this within their settings. But because some individuals can, then we can obviously drag that bubble just a little bit further away from institutions. And so why does this become a bit of an ethical issue? Well, anything to do with privacy obviously is an issue, and the sheer volume and range of information that is harvested by these tech and media giants like Google and YouTube's parent company Alphabet has some users concerned. If we invest ourselves into an Alphabet ecosystem, then we are really giving a lot of personal information about ourselves. And we cannot guarantee that a company like YouTube always has our best interests at heart. And of course, there is always the risk of this personal information being exposed through leaks or through hacks. At the moment, it must be said that Google and YouTube are pretty good at keeping user information private, but it's always susceptible. And when we think of the targeted advertising campaign that the Hyundai case study highlights, it creates this sort of ethically grey area where people might be served ads based on where they've been in order to change their behaviours. And while car purchasing isn't exactly a big deal, this might have implications in more ethically questionable areas, such as being served gambling ads for people who are attending sporting events. Or consider women who visit a family health clinic being served either pro or anti-abortion content. And finally, by customizing content, this can actually result in filter bubbles, which can limit society's understanding and tolerance of alternative points of view and actually limit what we see from the world around us. We have access to a literal world of videos on YouTube. However, we are being so significantly limited in terms of what we see because 70% of the content that we engage with is the content that YouTube recommends to us based only on what we've seen in the past. But if you think that the way that YouTube uses their data is questionable, let's get to TikTok, who have a particularly dodgy track record when it comes to the use and misuse of user data. As we know, TikTok is the social media platform of choice for teens and kids. And so they have to operate with some really specific laws when it comes to children's privacy. If you've ever wondered why social media platforms have age restrictions, it's mostly to comply with a specific United States federal law called the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act of 1998, or COPPA as it's more commonly known. This act protects citizens' data by preventing any online company, whether that's media or otherwise, from harvesting and retaining the data of children under the age of 13 years old without their specific parental approval. And so TikTok, it should be no surprise to us, has failed to protect children. Yes, yet again. In February 2019, TikTok was actually fined $5.7 million US, which is the largest penalty ever issued under the COPPA law. They were fined this for failing to protect the privacy of children. It was ruled in the US court that TikTok illegally collected personal information from children by not obtaining their parents' permission before they signed up. Now, these charges applied for when TikTok was actually known as Musical.ly, and anybody who was using their app, just like anybody who uses TikTok today, could see that a vast number of the users were under the age of 13. And so TikTok couldn't argue against this fine and had to pay it in full. However, since then, TikTok says that they've added more robust ID checking processes and has created a kids version of the app which has limited services and doesn't collect user data. There's a really great summary of this case provided by ABC Children's news program BTN, and I'll include the link in the description below. It's really useful to watch, even though BTN is targeted a little bit younger. They do a really great summary of this, as it's an issue that was important to young people, and so a lot of the adult news companies just didn't cover the case. But why is TikTok's dealing with COPPA a legal and ethical issue? Well, as we know, children are seen as especially vulnerable when it comes to the media, and specifically vulnerable when it comes to online spaces, because they don't necessarily have the mental capacity to understand what, when, and how the personal information that they share will be used by any online service providers. Now, the majority of adults just click straight through when they see terms and conditions, but at least they're mature enough to understand what they're signing up for. And it's argued that children are not. Furthermore, this issue has resulted in TikTok now forcing users to enter their date of birth before creating an account. It then asks for parents' email addresses if the user enters a date of birth younger than 13. Is this action by TikTok foolproof? Of course not. It remains really easy for children to enter a false date of birth or a false parental email. Finally, while COPPA is a US piece of legislation, it has broader reaching implications, as companies like TikTok are globalized media institutions. It is far easier and legally safer for a media entity like TikTok to comply with national US law on a global scale, even though they legally don't have to, rather than having a different version with different rules on the app for every single country that they trade in. Furthermore, TikTok also uses artificial intelligence to now scan for users who might appear under the age of 13 and block them. However, the ethical issues that rise out of this is that they've never explained how this AI system works, and some legitimate users over the age of 13 have complained that their accounts have been wrongfully blocked because this AI system incorrectly identifies their youthful features for being childish. And of course, like all AI facial recognition technology, this can be really easily bypassed. And even flicking through TikTok, you can see how young people are using memojis or something as low tech as a face mask can actually work to confuse this software and keep children on the app. Now, at the time, the COPPA fine seemed like a very big deal, but of course, that was in the quaint era of 2019. Another case study that we can look at is what has happened to TikTok ever since. And to put it simply, it has gotten worse and worse for the social media platform. In 2020, TikTok's parent company ByteDance received increased scrutiny from a range of national governments. This wasn't due to any past wrongdoing like what happened with the COPPA fine when TikTok was Musical.ly, but rather out of concern for ByteDance's status as a Chinese company. Now, in 2017, the Chinese government implemented a new national intelligence law. This meant that the Chinese government can actually force businesses to share data and information with them. As such, there is great concern that TikTok users from around the world might have their personal information obtained and used by the Chinese government for their own national purposes. Now that's concerning enough, but it becomes more distressing when we actually look at what data TikTok actually harvests. TikTok collects a vast amount of user information, including their interactions with videos on the app, watch times, comments, likes, shares, whether they play through a video multiple times, whether they visit another user's profile, if they search up the audio that's connected to that video, if they save the video, etc. Basically, anything that a user does on TikTok itself is recorded. But TikTok also collects information outside the app, such as location data, a user's camera and image galleries. It even collects the keystroke rhythms that people exhibit when they type in and outside the app. So this essentially means that anything that you type, passwords, personal text messages, personal emails, that information of how you're using the keyboard on your phone is recorded by TikTok. And the app also regularly scans and reads any copy and paste clipboards of users. So any photos that you've copied from elsewhere, any URLs or links to websites, even if you have highlighted and copied passwords, they will see that. And if that list of private information is concerning to you, it should actually be noted that this type of data collection is comparable with what most social media networks like Facebook and Instagram collect themselves. The global concern, though, is that Facebook is a company situated in a democratic country like the United States, which has laws in place to protect user information, whereas ByteDance does not. Interestingly though, ByteDance is not a media company. Primarily, its focus is on developing artificial intelligence, so it claims to collect data for those purposes. This explains why a lot of TikTok's filters are actually really good, because ByteDance uses their facial recognition and other AI technology to improve the app's function. Furthermore, ByteDance also claims that it would not be compelled to share data with the Chinese government, since it stores data from US and Australian users in either the US itself or in Singapore. However, critics and legal academics actually disagree with this claim. So what has happened as a result of this? Well, in more of a reflection of international tensions with China rather than any problems with media companies per se, various nations have responded to this threat as follows. In June 2020, India actually banned TikTok and removed it from its app stores, along with a number of other apps that were developed in China. And in July 2020, an Australian government advisory committee that was made up of a range of intelligence agencies reviewed the app and ultimately did not recommend to ban it. However, Australian Defence Force personnel are forbidden from using TikTok either on Defence Force phones or on their own personal devices. And that in itself should indicate how likely the Australian government sees that TikTok's data could actually be used by the Chinese government for national purposes.
The Australian Defence Force recently joined the US military in barring TikTok from all work devices.
I support it 100%, and I would go so far as to say not just work phones or devices, but also personal devices. Espionage can be conducted on social media platforms. We have to be far more cautious about all these tech platforms.
But the big move, however, has come from the United States. And what has happened there probably has the biggest ramifications for TikTok and therefore ByteDance. In August 2020, the United States President Donald Trump issued an executive order giving ByteDance 90 days to sell TikTok to a United States company. If ByteDance fails to do this, the order rules that transactions between TikTok and the US will cease, effectively banning the platform because TikTok couldn't be hosted on the App Store of American companies like Apple or Google. Trump made it really clear the reasons behind this executive order, citing national security as the rationale behind the decision.
Parents, if you don't know what TikTok is, you should.
In the US, the government is so alarmed by TikTok's ties to China, it's launched a national security investigation.
A company compromised by the Chinese Communist Party knows where your children are, knows what they look like, what their voices sound like.
This is another example of how China is aggregating information. The more data it has on individuals, what they do, why they do it, who they are, the more it can create artificial intelligence based on that data.
Now, as of this recording in early September 2020, ByteDance has yet to sell and is considering avenues to legally challenge this executive order, although the TikTok American CEO has resigned and they are currently negotiating with a range of other United States companies. This obviously puts ByteDance in a really difficult position where both India and the US account for its biggest markets, and this will be a really interesting case study to see as it evolves. But for the purposes of studying for VCE Media, we can just note the events that have happened before September 2020. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about this issue and the implications of it, I'll include in the description below a link to a video by Recode that actually dives into some of the broader reasons that have brought this executive order about, as well as the potential implications that this could have across the entire internet. Now, I should let you know that you really only need to know one of these case studies in detail, but it's interesting to see them together as TikTok has grown in popularity amongst users, and yet their reputation has been diminished in the eyes of governments worldwide. And when we look at how this sits amongst our stakeholder relationships, it absolutely shows the power of governments, where governments might typically punish media institutions for wrongdoing with heavy fines. This was seen when TikTok broke the copper legislation in the US and shows that governments do have the power to wrestle back some control from the media institutions. However, the second case study highlights that the drastic ruling forced upon TikTok by various national governments such as India and the US demonstrates the ultimate power that governments hold when controlling the media. In this unit, we've mainly focused on the relationship between individuals and institutions and how in contemporary media there is a real wrestling for control between them. However, this highlights that the government can ultimately step in and completely ban media institutions from operating and connecting with users at all. And a summary of why this is a legal issue. Well, again, we're talking about privacy here, and the volume and range of information that's harvested by ByteDance has many governments concerned. Globalized media institutions need to comply with the laws of the nations in which they're based. This can create some political tensions when some nations like China can force companies to share information about citizens from other nations around the globe. And this then leads to those other governments feeling like they're forced to act in the interests of citizens' privacy and national security. Finally, this concept of blocking certain apps and platforms by governments is becoming more frequent, and it has some people concerned that it's threatening the concept of a free and open internet. While we hear vocal critics of policies like Trump's border wall, perhaps we need to pay more attention to the walls that governments are building around their internet, limiting citizens from seeing content and engaging with things from other nations. So there you have what is a really complex and ever-evolving issue in the media. We can see through the case studies analysed here, of which you really only need to know perhaps one or two in great detail, that data is essential for contemporary media organisations to function. However, they need to be ethically responsible and ultimately held to account by governments when they deal with such important personal information from individual users. So hopefully there's something from this video that you might be able to apply to your SAC or exam. And perhaps you've learned a little bit more about one of the social media apps that you use in your daily practice. Thanks for watching.